Anyway, she didn't split the Beatles. The Beatles were drifting apart on their own.
Before his tragic death in 1980, John Lennon left behind more than just timeless music. In private letters, late-night conversations, and whispered recollections, he hinted at hidden encounters with Hollywood's most untouchable stars. These weren't the stories of fame or friendship we already know. These were secrets about the men he loved in silence, actors whose public images would never have survived the truth. Tonight, we dive into Lennon's most intimate confessions and the secret world of Hollywood romance he carried to his grave. To understand the men John Lennon may have secretly loved, we first need to understand the world he lived in. A world where public image was everything, and secrets could make or break a career. John Lennon was no stranger to controversy. He was outspoken, unfiltered, and at times deliberately provocative. But beneath the headlines of political protests, psychedelic experimentation, and musical genius, there was another John, one who explored intimacy outside the narrow boundaries of the era. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of revolution, but also repression. Hollywood was a glittering machine built on images of masculinity and perfection. Being openly gay or even bisexual was considered career suicide for male stars. Studio contracts sometimes included morality clauses, making it clear that any hint of homosexuality would lead to blacklisting. Lennon, however, was never bound by Hollywood's rules. His fame came from Liverpool, London, and eventually New York. That gave him freedom, but also made him a magnet for those living in the shadows of fame. Sources close to Lennon, including old friends and assistants, hinted that he moved in private circles where actors, musicians, and artists could express their desires away from the public eye. One of Lennon's closest confidants once described wild nights in Los Angeles during his so-called lost weekend in the mid-1970s. While the public saw drunken brawls and paparazzi photos with May Pang, insiders whispered about private after-parties where Lennon was far more experimental. These were places where secrecy was assumed, and powerful men, many of them actors, mingled freely without fear of headlines. What made Lennon different was his openness in private. While some Hollywood stars lived double lives, terrified of exposure, Lennon reportedly spoke candidly about attraction to men, especially those who embodied the charisma and defiance he admired. In letters that surfaced years later, and in fragments of conversations preserved by biographers, Lennon seemed to hint that his romantic life was broader, wilder, and more complicated than fans ever knew. Hollywood's elite often gravitated toward Lennon. He was unpredictable, magnetic, and one of the few people who didn't need Hollywood to survive. For actors trapped in the rigid studio system, Lennon represented both danger and freedom. To be with him, even secretly, was to taste a rebellion they couldn't afford in public. Yet secrecy weighed heavily. Lennon knew that revealing names, or being too open, could devastate lives. The industry was ruthless, and a single scandal could erase careers. So, while he teased and hinted, he rarely put details in writing. Still, those who spent nights with him remembered enough to confirm the rumors. Lennon was drawn to Hollywood men, and some of them, in turn, were drawn to him. This first glimpse into Lennon's hidden world sets the stage for the names that would later surface, the actors he trusted, the men he quietly loved, and the secret relationships that blurred the line between friendship and romance. As Lennon himself once said in an offhand remark, "Love is love, the rest is just fear." In private conversations during the 1970s, Lennon began dropping names, not in interviews, never in print, but among those he trusted. 2 of those names belonged to actors who embodied Hollywood's golden charm, but lived in constant fear of exposure. The first name Lennon reportedly mentioned was Montgomery Clift, a brilliant actor whose struggles with identity and addiction were as well known behind closed doors as his performances were on screen. By the 1960s, Clift was no longer the matinee idol he once was, but his presence in Hollywood's underground social circles remained legendary. Friends recalled that Lennon admired Clift's intensity and vulnerability. For Lennon, who often sought authenticity in people, Clift represented something rare in Hollywood, a man torn apart by truth but unwilling to fake a life that wasn't his. Although Lennon never openly confirmed a relationship, several insiders claimed the two shared more than just admiration. At small gatherings, away from cameras, Lennon and Clift were said to have exchanged moments of closeness, fleeting but powerful. For Lennon, who was experimenting with freedom and exploring his own desires, Clift was a man who embodied both risk and allure. The second name was even more shocking: James Dean. By the time Lennon was making waves in music, Dean was already long gone, killed in his 1955 car crash. But Lennon openly expressed fascination with Dean, calling him the original rebel. Some biographers and close associates suggest that Lennon often claimed to have met actors who ran in Dean's old circles, and at least once Lennon hinted that his connection to Dean was more than just admiration for a cultural icon. The whispers here are complicated. Dean himself was rumored to have relationships with both men and women, though none could ever be publicly confirmed. Lennon's fascination with Dean blurred the lines between reality, fantasy, and possibly even exaggeration. Was Lennon claiming intimacy with Dean to elevate his own rebel image, or did he truly share private encounters through mutual Hollywood friends before Dean's untimely death? We may never know for certain. But what's clear is that Lennon's interest in Dean went far beyond movie posters. In candid conversations, he spoke of Dean not just as a cultural figure, but as someone who understood the loneliness of being trapped by fame. For Lennon's confidants, these revelations were startling. They weren't just stories of chance meetings. They were personal confessions, spoken with the weight of truth. If accurate, Lennon wasn't just hinting at attraction. He was naming men who symbolized Hollywood's hidden struggles, its dual lives of glamour and repression. These first names highlight a recurring theme in Lennon's private life: his attraction to men who lived on the edge. Whether it was Clift's tortured brilliance or Dean's rebellious spirit, Lennon gravitated toward those who, like him, were both idolized and misunderstood. Of course, the risk of exposure was immense. Lennon's circle understood that repeating such claims outside private rooms could spark scandal. Hollywood was not ready for stories of its leading men sharing secret nights with the world's most famous Beatle. And so the names stayed hidden, whispered only in trust, until fragments surfaced years after Lennon's death. But these were only the beginning. As Lennon grew older and bolder in his private life, the names he revealed became even more daring. Actors, at the height of fame, men who had everything to lose if the truth ever slipped out. By the mid-1970s, John Lennon was no longer just hinting about Hollywood. The names he began to reveal shocked even his closest friends. These weren't fading stars from the past. These were men in their prime, powerful, beloved, and protected by the industry's tightest secrets. The third name Lennon revealed was Marlon Brando. Known as one of Hollywood's most iconic actors, Brando had a reputation for both brilliance and unpredictability. In public, he was the ultimate leading man, rugged, masculine, and seemingly untouchable. Yet behind the curtain, Brando was far more complex. In later years, he himself admitted to having relationships with men, though never in detail. Lennon, according to those who heard his private confessions, claimed that Brando wasn't just an icon he admired. He was someone he had encountered intimately. The connection reportedly occurred during Lennon's time in Los Angeles in the 1970s, a period filled with chaos, alcohol, and experimentation. Brando, already known for his eccentric and indulgent lifestyle, moved in similar private circles. For Lennon, the appeal was clear. Brando represented power, mystery, and the ability to challenge every societal expectation. Being close to Brando, even secretly, was both thrilling and dangerous. To speak Brando's name aloud was to brush against a Hollywood untouchable, someone whose reputation could not survive scandal. The fourth name Lennon mentioned was even more controversial: Paul Newman. Unlike Brando, Newman was seen as the golden boy of Hollywood, handsome, charitable, and devoted to his wife, Joanne Woodward. His clean-cut image made him one of the most beloved stars of his time. But Lennon hinted at another side. In private conversations, he described Newman as a man who lived two lives, suggesting that behind the perfect Hollywood marriage was a man who occasionally sought freedom away from the cameras. These claims, of course, were explosive. Newman's public persona was built on integrity and family values, and any whisper of scandal would have been devastating. Yet Lennon's confidants insisted that he spoke of Newman with both admiration and empathy. Lennon reportedly described Newman as cautious, careful, and unwilling to risk exposure, but still deeply human in his private struggles. Whether these encounters were fleeting or fabricated, Lennon's naming of Newman reveals the depth of secrecy surrounding Hollywood's brightest stars. For Lennon's inner circle, hearing names like Brando and Newman was both shocking and believable. Hollywood's culture of secrecy had always been there. What Lennon offered was confirmation that even the most powerful, most admired actors were not immune to living double lives. But why did Lennon reveal these names? Some suggest it was his way of unburdening himself, of sharing truths he couldn't speak publicly. Others believe it was bravado, a need to shock and intrigue. Whatever his motive, the names carried weight, and those who heard them never forgot. By this stage, Lennon's revelations were no longer harmless confessions. They had the potential to ignite scandals that could destroy reputations. Speaking them aloud, even in private, was an act of defiance, a reminder that Lennon, like Brando and Newman, refused to live by rules written by an unforgiving society. And yet, there was still one more name to come. The final revelation, the one Lennon spoke of with a mix of admiration, sorrow, and secrecy. A name that, even decades later, leaves lingering questions about truth, love, and the secrets Lennon carried with him to his grave. As John Lennon's life drew closer to its shocking end, his confessions grew more personal, more daring, and more haunting. Among the names he revealed, one stood out as his final and most controversial. A man adored worldwide, yet living under the same shadow of silence that haunted so many in Hollywood. The fifth and final name Lennon is said to have spoken was Rock Hudson. To the public, Hudson was the ultimate Hollywood leading man, a towering figure of masculinity, charm, and romance on screen. Women swooned over him, studios marketed him as the ideal husband, and the press treated him as untouchable. Yet behind the carefully crafted image, Hudson lived a life of secrecy, one that was only confirmed years later when his AIDS diagnosis forced the truth into public view. According to those close to Lennon, Hudson's name came up in one of his more intimate, late-night conversations. Lennon reportedly described Hudson as a man trapped by the lie of Hollywood. He spoke of encounters that were discreet, shielded from photographers and reporters, and always shrouded in silence. Whether Lennon exaggerated or not, his description carried an unmistakable tone of empathy. Lennon recognized the burden of living behind a mask. The connection, if true, was symbolic. Lennon, the rebellious Beatle, and Hudson, the studio-manufactured leading man, represented two extremes of fame. One defied expectations, the other was bound by them. For Lennon, the intimacy wasn't just about attraction, it was about solidarity. He saw in Hudson a reflection of his own struggles, the need to project an image for the world while secretly searching for freedom. These confessions, whispered in private and only pieced together after Lennon's death, reveal a man who refused to be boxed in by labels. To Lennon, love was not limited by gender, status, or societal rules. He spoke candidly of desire, connection, and the human need for truth, even when the world demanded silence. But why share these names at all? Those who knew Lennon best suggest it was part of his need for honesty. Lennon had spent his life challenging authority, breaking rules, and exposing lies. Revealing the names of the men he loved or admired in secret was just another form of rebellion, one final act of defiance against the hypocrisy of fame and society. And yet, tragedy struck before these truths could be fully explored. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered outside his New York home, silencing his voice forever. The secrets he carried, the names, the confessions, the relationships, were left in fragments, scattered across memories, journals, and whispered recollections. In the years that followed, Hollywood began to change. Rock Hudson's outing, Marlon Brando's candid admissions, and a growing movement for acceptance slowly peeled away the secrecy Lennon had spoken of. His confessions, whether literal or symbolic, remained part of a larger conversation about identity, repression, and the price of fame. At 40 years old, Lennon left the world too soon, but his legacy continues, not only in music, but in the truths he dared to share. By revealing the names of Hollywood's most guarded men, Lennon gave us a glimpse of a hidden world, a reminder that even icons live with secrets, and that love, in all its forms, deserves to be seen. In the end, Lennon once said, "The only thing worth fighting for is love."